Hello and welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Bob Riley, its director, and today I'm very happy to welcome for the first time as a Westminster speaker, Dr. Andrei Illarionov. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy in Washington. From 2000 to 2005, he was the chief economic advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin and the president's personal representative to the G8. Dr. Illarionov was the driving force behind the adoption of a 13% flat income tax, the Russian government's creation of a stabilization fund for windfall oil revenues, reduction in the size of government, and the early repayment of Russia's foreign debt. At the end of 2005, he resigned his post for what he said were three main reasons: the transformation of Russia into a politically non-free country, the capture of the Russian state by the corporation of secret police officers known as Siloviki, and horrific corruption within the Russian leadership. Earlier in 1992, Dr. Illarionov had served as an economic advisor to Russia's acting Prime Minister Igor Gaidar. And from 1993 to 94, he was chief economic advisor to Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin. Dr. Illarionov has written 3 books and more than 300 articles on Russian economic and social policies. He received his PhD from St. Petersburg University in 1987. Today he's going to discuss with us what makes Vladimir Putin tick.
Thank you, Professor Riley, for such a kind introduction and for inviting me to speak. So this topic is huge, and definitely we will not be able to cover all aspects and all angles of this topic. That is why I will try to focus my attention to a couple of topics that I think would be of interest for our audience, and especially for English language audience that might not be fully familiar with some aspects of the Russian life of this particular character. First of all, I need to tell something that is being downplayed here in the United States as well as many Western countries. Mr. Putin is a very capable person, and objectively speaking, he is a very talented one. Talented in many regards. He is very knowledgeable. He is working hard. He is reading a lot. He's talking to many people. And he's able to think fast, and he is able to find arguments and counter-arguments in the debate and discussions that not very many people are able to do. Sometimes we've been able to hear, especially at the eve of the Geneva-Biden-Putin summit, that, for example, American president grew through democratic, competitive process where he participated in many debates, and that is why he is much better prepared for debate, unlike Mr. Putin, who never participated in the competitive election and in the debate and so on. And I need to say that I met not very many leaders of states, maybe not one, who would be better prepared for debates of different kind. And I'm saying that because I met personally probably more than 50 heads of states, partially, mostly when I was advisor to Russian president and the Russian Sherpa, and after that. So once again, he's a very capable person. He's very reserved. He controls himself very well. He is very good in formulating his ideas, his messages, regardless whether they are correct or incorrect or they are openly false. Nevertheless, he is very accurate in sending message which he wanted to say send to the audience. But a part of his personal features and personal characteristics, what is important to know how he is using those skills. We need to accept that he has outstanding skills in a number of areas. How he's using those skills in one particular area of foreign policy. And here we need to come to his worldview, his ideology, his understanding of the state of the world. And here I need to say a little bit about two concepts that he has been able to develop, first of all, by himself, even with the help of some other people, but at least he became the most articulate person who was talking about these two concepts. One of those concepts is the concept of the so-called of divided nation or divided people, divided Russian nation or divided Russian people. At least for last 8 years, he continues to talk about divided Russian nation. What does it mean? It means, according to Putin, that there is no separate ethnic groups or separate ethnic nations like Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. According to Putin, this is one united nation or one united ethnicity with a little, just really slight differences in language, in culture, in attitudes, but essentially it is one nation which was artificially divided. He does not specify when, by whom, but it is divided. And he sees his one of the most duties as the president of Russia to unite all those nations under one roof. And he has even developed the formula for the so-called united Russian nation. He said, one language, meaning Russian language, and it is true that not only Russians, but Ukrainians and Belarusians, almost everybody without exception, do understand, and many of them do speak Russian very well. He said, one religion, Orthodox Christian religion, which is widespread in Russia, in Belarus, and in Ukraine. And he adds the third element to his formula, one prince, one language, one religion, and one prince. I hope it's not necessary to mention who exactly should be that one prince. All right, so this concept of one nation or united nation, Putin was able to spread around, and it became almost official position of the Russian administration, Russian government in the last 8 years, and especially since attack on Ukraine, on occupation and annexation of Crimea, and an occupation of Eastern Donbass. But there is another concept, ideological concept, that he has developed over the last 2 decades, and for the first time Putin was able to put it on a paper in his article in Nezavissimaya Gazeta on January 23rd, year 2012. This is a concept of historic Russia. This is a very interesting term because those who studied Russia, not only in the West, not only outside of Russia, but even within Russia, would not find this concept in textbooks or in widespread literature. This is something that he, meaning Putin, was able to develop with help of few other advisors and assistants, mostly by himself. The concept of historic Russia means that the current territory of Russian Federation and historic Russia is not the same. And it is also not the same as the former Soviet Union. And that is why to put equal sign between the today's Russia and today's Russian borders, or former Soviet Union borders, and imaginable or imagined historic Russia, according to Mr. Putin, would be incorrect. So that is why Mr. Putin spent some time explaining his understanding of historic Russia, and he has put forward at least 3 criteria how he understands historic Russia. First of all, it is one language. It means territories where is one language being used. Not surprised, it is a Russian language. Second criteria, one religion. Not a very big surprise, it's an Orthodox Christian religion. And he adds one more element, because the obvious question would arise: where are the borders of this historic Russia? And in that article that I mentioned in year 2012, Putin identified the borders of the former Russian Empire at the end of 18th century as the borders of historic Russia. Anyone who is interested in that topic can download the map of the Russian Empire at the end of 18th century and would find that the western border of the Russian Empire then was going from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea along the rivers Neman, Western Buk, Zbruch, Dniester. Maybe not everybody who listen to us and who watch us at this moment is familiar with the geography of that particular region, but it would be helpful to just understand that the whole territory of current Republic of Belarus, independent state, according to Mr. Putin, belongs to historic Russia. Almost all territory of Ukraine, with exception of western Ukraine, Galicia, Volyn, Transcarpathia and Bukovina, all the rest belongs to historic Russia. Transnistria, the part of Moldova Republic, which lies on the left bank of River Dniester, belongs to historic Russia, according to Mr. Putin. Also, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, with a little strip, without little strip, belongs to historic Russia. So that is why we can see that the approach of Mr. Putin is towards historic Russia is very close to his approach to the so-called divided nation that should be united. One language, one religion, the border of Russian Empire at the end of 18th century, and the final element of that concept is one prince. And that is why what we have seen for more than 10 years since Putin's aggression against Georgia in year 2008 continuing with his aggression against Ukraine in the year 2014, with occupation and annexation of Crimea, with war in Donbass, are they just elements, steps in full realization of his very well thought through program of recreation of historic Russia in reunited of the so-called divided Russian nation, divided Russian people? It means that what we have seen in year 2008 and what we can see in Georgia and what we can see since year 2014 in Ukraine, it is not the final finished steps at which Mr. Putin decided to stop. No, it's just very first steps in realizing and implementing his very close to his mind concept of restoration of the united people and restoration or creation, because it never existed before, of the so-called historic Russia. And that is why this revanchist approach to foreign policy to immediate neighbors for Russia is the crucial element of the real policy that is being implemented by Putin while he is the president of Russian Federation at the moment. That is why nobody should sleep quietly, relaxing, not expecting that Mr. Putin decided not to bother his neighbors. It would be not the position as the one that has been advocated by former US ambassador in Moscow, who said, okay, Putin occupied and annexed Crimea because he had a very bad mood that day when he organized Olympic Games in Sochi in year 2014. No. This concept has been developed by Putin at least from year 2003, when he was on record was talking about that, okay, it would be very good to have Kiev is the capital of independent Ukraine, to be within Russia, because Kiev is a sacrosanct place for Russian Orthodox people that has many monuments, many churches, many cathedrals that are very close to Orthodox Christian minds. And that is why this part of territory, with some little belongings, should be given to Russia. In April year 2008, when he met US President George Bush at the NATO summit in Bucharest, he told openly to Bush directly and at the gatherings of this NATO summit that Ukraine is not a real state, that half of the territory of Ukraine is not Ukraine and does not belong to Ukraine. It belongs to Russia. He said it is historical territory that should belong, historically was Russian and should belong to Russia. Then, in April year 2008, people could not believe their ears, and they thought that it's probably a bad joke. No, it was not a bad joke. It was an ideology. It was a world view, and it was a part of the program that is in realizations for a particular period of time. That is why, if you'd like to understand what next move might be from Mr. Putin, you need to study his set of mind, his ideas, his ideology, his interest. And frankly speaking, he is not hiding those views. He is open. Over the last almost 10 years, he has used this concept and this term, the very term historic Russia or divided nation, many, many times. And that is why when he would have such a chance to implement this policy in reality, he would do it. And the Biden-Putin summit in Geneva that finished just yesterday, it gives enormous opportunity, gives green light to Mr. Putin to implement this policy in reality. Because unfortunately, US President did nothing to confront Mr. Putin, did nothing to stand up to Mr. Putin, did nothing to defend neither Ukraine, nor Belarus, nor human rights in Russia and Belarus from Putin's pressure. Putin understands very well strengths and weakness, and he saw weakness of the US leadership at the distance of his hand. That is why, no doubt, he would try to do everything possible to use this weakness to implement his strategic, darling goal for him to create so-called historic Russia and to attack Russia's neighbors, trying to establish control over Ukraine, over Belarus, over part of Moldova, and might be over other territories.
Well, that takes a moment to digest. But let me ask you, what are the conditions under which he might make his next move? You say he can discern weakness, and that he saw weakness in Geneva. But does he have a strategy? And if so, there must be conditions for implementing it. I mean, for instance, in the spring, there were more than 80,000 Russian troops gathered not far from the border with Ukraine and fully deployed, field hospitals, everything that the Russian military would need for a conflict. And of course, President Putin said this is just a standard military exercise. But it's close enough to the border that the NATO members were alarmed that he might move. Then slowly the troops are dispersed. He's done this more than once. Is the idea there to sort of wear down NATO to the point at which he does decide to move? They're caught unaware and flat-footed and really can't do anything about it. In other words, is his next move military?
Okay, first of all, in March and April this year, when there was this high concentration of the Russian troops along the Ukrainian borders and in the occupied Ukrainian territories like in Donbass and in Crimea, Putin was not ready to launch a large-scale intervention into Ukrainian territory. Why? We know it for sure. The concentration of troops itself does not mean necessarily that Putin was ready to attack, to organize incursions. Because for that, to do so, it is necessary to have conditions, those conditions that you are talking about. So the question arises, what kind of conditions Putin needs to start full-scale operation? First of all, we have to look into how this concentration was going on. It was going on open, in the daytime. In many cases, all these troops were moving towards the border absolutely unmasked, while the downtowns or villages or cities that hundreds of people were able to see it and to make pictures, to make video and to post on social media. Only even that one would be very strong indication it's not the case when Mr. Putin is going to attack. When Mr. Putin attacked Georgia in August 2008, almost nobody was able to detect concentration of 100,000 troops on the borders of Georgia. When in year 2014, in February and March, Putin attacked Ukraine and occupied Crimea, even US intelligence publicly said, we are not expecting that Putin is going to occupy Crimea. They have not seen it because they were hiding. In August 2014, none of the intelligence were able to see concentration of Russian troops to attack Ukrainians near Ilovaisk. In January and February 2015, once again, neither Ukrainian intelligence nor US intelligence were able to see Russian troops that were going to attack near Debaltseve. So we can say that if Putin shows his troops, it means he's not going to attack. When he's going to attack, at least so far, intelligence on the ground were not able to detect it. At least we're not able to detect sufficiently enough to send a signal, yes, this is alert to something really. So this is the first one. Second one, Mr. Putin did not concentrate enough forces near the borders. To start a really serious operation, he needs more. Even 80,000, or some people say 100,000, it is not something that he's looking for. He's looking for something bigger than that. Third, and maybe the most important fact, in March, April this year, there were American troops in Europe because they were preparing and participating in the military drills Defender Europe 2021. Putin never attacked his neighbors when American troops in Europe. Never. He's waiting until American troops will finish their drills and will come back to the United States. That is time for Putin. Putin is a very calculated person. He's taken into account all important conditions. And the most important factor is that Putin himself is planning his own military drills, which is called West 2021. And those military drills will be organized together with Belarusian troops. And they will happen in September this year. And the military drills of such type allows, so-called legitimately, to concentrate much larger military force than even what we have seen in March and April. We don't know how much, but based on the previous experience of Zapad or West, year 2017, and Center 2019, I'm using these names for military maneuvers that Putin was organizing 4 years ago and 2 years ago. In the first case, there were 100,000 troops participated, and the other one, 127,000 troops. So that is why it cannot be excluded that it could be 150,000 troops, especially with Belarusians at this moment, plus about 40,000 in occupied Donbass. So that is why it might be that the total amount of troops that Putin can move towards Ukrainian borders might be 190,000 or even maybe 200,000. That is something serious that he can use for large-scale interventions against Ukraine. But this time will be not much in April this year. It would be much higher risk of such operation later this year, probably in September. Once again, it is not a guarantee, and nobody can produce a guarantee. But we need to say that the risk of such crisis, such operation in September this year is higher than this spring.
Let's step back for a moment in order to ask you, to what extent, you say that President Putin is very open about his vision of historic Russia and divided nation, and obviously reuniting this divided nation. To what extent do you think do the Russian people, or the peoples of Russia, because they're not all Russian, share this vision? Is this a source of popularity for Putin?
Definitely, to some extent, yes. And he could capitalize on support of some part of population on this revanchist or neo-imperialist vision. And we have seen that after intervention against Georgia, his popularity jumped up very substantially. And after occupation and annexation of Crimea, it jumped up almost to 90%. It was 85, 86, even 87, or even 88% for some time. And it has been done by independent sociological company, so that is why at least some level of trust, of confidence for such polls can be given. So that is why it was extremely popular, and even such a term has been invented, Crimean consensus, meaning that the support of this intervention and occupation and annexation among the Russian population was extremely high. So we don't know what will happen next time, if that next time will come, if Putin will organize another intervention. But it cannot be excluded that such operation would enjoy substantial popularity among Russian population. But having said so, I once again would underscore that with all due respect to this popularity issue, Putin has his own vision, and this his own vision for him seems to me is even more important than this popularity support, because he feels himself, even sometimes he mentioned it, that he now is so high in his self-esteem that there is no one in the world that he can talk to except of Mahatma Gandhi, but Mahatma Gandhi not with us anymore. So that is why he is kind of talking to the higher authorities in the skies, or even maybe above the skies. And that is why he's trying to fulfill this whole God-given agenda to him, regardless what all those people around him are talking about.
Does this mean that he takes the Russian Orthodox faith seriously himself? Or is he just using that as a means through which to exercise control, as the Russian state has for so many years?
Some observers are saying that, okay, this is really some kind of cover-up, that he's pretty cynical and he's using it just to portray himself as a Christian person, but he's not. I've seen him in a number of situations that I can say no. He's some kind of devotee to this, but I would not say that it's a Christian religion, at least as I understand it, and probably as many other people understand it, because Christianity is also is not to produce harm to others and to respect dignity of other people. It is not such a Christianity. It's a very different type of Christianity, according to Mr. Putin. But when you can see him in some churches, when he's doing some
prayers,
yes, you would not have any doubt that it is something very deep in him. But once again, it is something different from traditional or very widespread understanding of Christianity.
It's very interesting to hear you explain this grand vision and the extent to which Vladimir Putin is animated by it, because many analysts of Russia here portray him as simply a Machiavellian opportunist whose principal concern is the preservation and augmentation of his power and the protection of those close to him whom he needs, and the protection of their assets as well. So that there's nothing much to see there beyond this narrow self-interest. But you are painting a very different picture from those who say that kind of thing.
No, that is why you have invited me to
Yes, of
talk
course.
here at
Right.
the Westminster Institute, and that is why I'm saying what I've seen with my own eyes and what is a result of my own analysis. And that is why, thank you for this comparison to views of some American pundits that, frankly speaking, do have very limited understanding of Mr. Putin and of modern Russia, of the contemporary Russia. Even they are very popular here. Probably it is much more convenient to think about Putin as you have described, but it has very, very big difference between that description and what Mr. Putin is himself.
Can you then relate President Putin's foreign policy to this grand vision? Help us understand his moves in Syria, in Libya, his discrete uses of force there to gain a great deal. How do they relate to historic Russia or the divided nation thesis?
It's not necessarily should be attributed to historic Russia vision or some kind of reunification of the so-called Russian people, including Ukrainians and Belarusians, because not too many Ukrainians and Belarusians in Syria and Libya and in other places. No, here he's doing his foreign policy of much more traditional, of imperial character, supporting the context with the brotherly tyrants and dictators around the world who are in need of support from Putin, political, diplomatic, military, from political police and so on, sometimes financial, sometimes it's a kind of business-like relations of Venezuela or something like that. But there is one more element which also partially business type relations and partially ideological one, because in all those cases are those countries, those regimes are authoritarians, dictatorships, and that is why he feels himself absolutely necessary to support them. This is some kind of dictators international. And he understands if one of those dictators fall, it means the next one will be a next one, and finally will be he. So that is why by keeping them alive and on float, it means he is strengthening himself. He does not allow them to fall, and that is why he supports the whole international. And that in that particular business, he feels that he has essentially only one serious adversary, the United States. And everybody understands that only one country in the world is physically able, and if the right person at the top of the United States is able mentally to stand up in reality against Putin and able to crush his troops, as it happened in year 2018 in Syria, when the United States troops kind of destroyed private military company Wagner, which is essentially quasi-Russian troops in Syria. That was the first time for any US-Russia military contact that was ended with total elimination of this particular group, about 200 troops. And Mr. Putin learned this lesson very well, that if somebody in the White House, and it was a time of President Trump in the White House, if somebody in the White House who either can give an order or he would not resist of using force by American military, his troops can be destroyed within minutes or hours. And that is why the most important thing that he is looking for, the level of readiness of the current US president to use force to defend freedom, liberties, rule of law, independence of different countries around the world. So that is why he tested each president one by one, whether they're able or not. He thought that George Bush would not use American force, and that is why Putin, moved Russian troops into Georgia. And it was a moment when there was a very big, very serious debate in the White House, in the Bush White House, whether to use US force or not. And on August 11th, year 2008, George Bush appeared near the White House, flanked by his Secretary of Defense and his assistant for national security assistance, and he said, okay, I would not recommend Mr. Putin to make another step. And US Navy moved to the Black Sea, and US Air Force moved to bases in Turkey and Romania. Next day, August 12th, Mr. Medvedev, who was officially president of Russia, has announced that Operation in Georgia is finished. That was a decision affected, influenced by decision of George Bush, President of the United States. Then Putin tested Mr. Obama in year 2014 when he moved his troops in Crimea. And we remember what Obama answered. He said publicly, I'm not going using American troops to defend Ukraine. What Mr. Putin said? Thank you very much, Mr. Obama. I suspected that you would not use troops, but thank you very much for telling openly that you're not going to use troops. But I will. And he did use troops, and he occupied Crimea and annexed it, and he moved troops into eastern Donbass. When he met President Trump, he could not figure out whether Trump would use troops or not. In year 2018, it became clear when the CVK, or private military company Wagner, has been destroyed in Syria. And Mr. Putin understood. Probably it's better not to try to test Mr. Trump anymore, because nobody knows what will happen after that. But when Mr. Biden appeared in White House, for Putin became absolutely clear that Biden would never dare to stand up to Mr. Putin. And that is why next day after inauguration, it was a substantial jump in hostilities on the Russian-Ukrainian line in Ukraine, in Donbass. 5 days later, Putin started to put pipeline Nord Stream 2 in the Baltic Sea, and so on and so on. And especially now, after the Geneva summit, for Mr. Putin became absolutely clear, 100% clear, that Biden would not use any force against Russia, not any force against to defend Ukraine, not even to supply necessary weapons or whatever to defend Ukraine. It means Biden gave a green light for new adventures of Putin against its neighbors.
In his various contestations with the United States, does that also increase Putin's popularity at home?
It is hard to see it so simple, because definitely there are some people who are happy with that, but there are some people that are unhappy. When there is some material results, like acquisition of South Ossetia and Abkhazia with occupation, that's very visible. So-called our troops moved to another territory. In other words, so-called acquisition of Crimea and Eastern Donbass. Okay, Russian troops again moved there. So this is visible. It's not necessary to have any propaganda campaign, because this is the fact of life. All these details, all this peculiarity in diplomacy are not so visible, and that is why it is not very clear what's going on. But when there is something that can be presented, that's a different story.
Now, just to go back to Syria and the American troops wiping out the Wagner Group in 2018, would you extrapolate from that on the quality of Russian military today? That when you said wherever the potential of American military force being used, then Putin will back up because he thinks those American forces are militarily superior or more capable? Is that?
No, for that purpose, we need to have a serious, good military expert, and maybe not one, who would provide us with information, with the approaches. And as we all understand, this is actually crucial element for any military preparation and any military analysis. We cannot do it. But let me say that the more important, at least equally important, on the quality of troops on the ground, maybe even more important than the quality of troops on the ground, is the quality of the leadership. Military leadership and political leadership. Because if even the stronger army has, as we called, a ship at the top, even they have lions in the ranks, that army would lose to the army of ships if the leader is a lion. It's an old saying, but essentially it says, if the military and political leadership is coward, is weak, they not by definition, but in many cases would lose the more aggressive, more organized, more determined adversary, even if that adversary has weaker troops.
Well, just as a side note, the military modernization undertaken by Russia with President Putin is impressive. They've developed some very impressive weaponry, as well as nuclear modernization. Now, how does President Putin see the historic Russia, or the vision of a reunited, divided nation, play into the behemoth to his south, China, and the closer relationship and what appears to be a developing strategic partnership with China, which is obviously a far larger economy and military power than Russia.
For Putin, it became one of the most important decisions that he has taken. In year 2000, when he became Russian president for the first time, he did not have such a vision and he did not have such an approach. In early days and years of his presidency, he wanted to develop relations with the West. He wanted to develop relations with the United States. He wanted to develop strategic partnership with the United States and NATO. Not once Putin said, both publicly and privately at diplomatic negotiations with the Western leaders, that he would be interested if Russia would become a full-fledged member of NATO. He said it not once to George Bush Jr. when he was the President of the United States. Probably historians of future would devote to this particular story not a single volume, trying to understand what happened and why the Western leaders rejected Putin, why they refused to take him, why they said Russia will not be taken into NATO. And after March year 2003, after launching operation in Iraq against Saddam Hussein, that honeymoon between Putin on one hand and Bush on the other hand ended. That was the probably 1.5 year from 9/11 up to March year 2003, when the issue of potential joining Russia into NATO was really on a table of Putin, and he was absolutely serious in discussing these options with his Western colleagues.
What did he think he had to gain by joining NATO?
Security. Everybody in this world, responsible leader of any country, is looking for security. And Putin that time was considering China as the main threat to Russia.
I see. Okay, that's the perfect answer.
And that is why he considered that Russia, as a member of the Western Alliance, would provide the best security for the country and for himself.
Now that
the only decisive answer, no, given by the West to Putin, forced him to think what other options are available. And he found that he could develop relations with China, and it took years for him. It was not overnight. It was years of difficult, lengthy conversations and negotiations with China, developing new level of trust between two former adversaries. Finally, it reached some particular level that never been achieved in the history of the Russia-Chinese relations. And now, as Putin himself said in his recent interview to NBC, it is late for you, trying to destroy our union, our strategic partnership with China. Once again, this is a topic of enormous interest and enormous analysis. What might be achieved in early year 2000s if the Western leaders would say yes to Mr. Putin, would start to work in this direction, to set criteria, to set conditions, and so on. What kind of world might be, and what kind of Russia might be in this particular situation?
Well, Russia was given an office in NATO headquarters.
No,
in
it's
Brussels.
joke. No. We are talking not about this kind of story. We are talking about really serious relations, about serious partnership, and that was this office of this. It was a kind of compensation for not
I see.
inviting Russia as a potential full-fledged member in the alliance.
All right, you might talk a bit about why Iraq was so important to Putin and why that was the point at which he forsook any development of the relation, to close development with NATO or with the United States. I had thought previous to that the U.S. actions in the former Yugoslavia created a huge amount of damage in the relationship with Russia.
Probably yes, but it was the Yeltsin's Russia.
Right.
It was not Putin who was taking the most important decision that time. He was already in the higher echelons of Russian government, but it was not him who was taking the most important decisions. But the story with Iraq was a different one, because he did have personal conversations and negotiations with George Bush many times, and they have developed substantial level of trust, personal trust among each other. And that is why Putin felt himself, if you allow me to say so, betrayed, because he thought that based on this level of trust, he would be consulted about Iraq, and he was not. And even he tried to contact and to talk to Bush. I don't know details, maybe only these two persons can say what exactly happened. But looks like that Bush decided not to share some important either intelligence or data or his intentions or his plans. And Putin for himself started to feel that if in this particular situation he could be betrayed, as he thought, it could happen in any other situation.
That's strong language, betrayal. Is it because Iraq had been a Soviet client state?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Well, in thinking back to what you call an historic opportunity to have developed a closer relationship with Russia, or even allowed it inside of NATO, today in the United States, as you well know, there's a bipartisan consensus that the greatest challenge the United States faces today is China. Just as in years past it was the Soviet Union, and thus this relationship between the United States and Mao Zedong took place. And it would be in the great interest of the United States were it able to lure Russia away from this strategic partnership with China today. But from what you say, the train has left the station, and Putin has indicated it's too late.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's true.
Don't you think, though, in the long run, speaking of history, that that decision may come back to harm Russia? Because China is by far the senior partner in that relationship, and there are many Chinese in Siberia now. They may have a dream of an historic China that includes parts of Russia.
It is all this very well known in Russia. It is very well known to Putin. It is not the problem. The problem is trust. And this is a very important issue. It is a very important issue in international relations, in diplomacy, and especially in interpersonal diplomacy. If there is no interpersonal trust, it's impossible to build any serious relations. The problem with the current leader of Russia, he does not feel that he is being trusted by Americans or Westerns, and it's not a very big surprise. He is not trusted. Everybody says, including the current US president, that he does not trust Mr. Putin. Why he should develop any serious long-term relations if he is not trusted? And by the way, Putin himself does not trust Western leaders. So that is why, at least until Putin is in Kremlin, it's impossible to expect anything like that, regardless what might be consequences of that level, trust or mistrust. It's just impossible. But when Mr. Putin gone, and instead of Mr. Putin will be somebody else in Russia, the same question would arise again. How to develop trust between future Russian leaders, future Russian leadership, and leadership of Western countries. Without that trust, it would be impossible to build strategic partnership or union, or to include Russia into future NATO or any other security alliance. It would be impossible. That's a very important element.
No, but the trust has to be based upon on something, and if Mr. Putin's successor would be as animated by a vision of historic Russia as you say he is, that leader might be very hard to trust as well.
We don't know who will be the
we don't
next
know or
leader,
whether they'll share
and
that.
we don't know what kind of views of the next leader will be towards historic Russia. This concept is developed by Putin. It does not necessarily that other people, even in his close entourage, would share his views in this regard.
Is that right?
Some of them, yes, might be, but some of them not. And definitely, in Russia, there are many people who are Western-oriented people, and who do see future Russia in the union with Western countries.
Let me ask you a couple of questions in our closing moments that pertain more to the character of Russia in terms of its past. If we have time, we'll go to the corruption issue, which was one of the three main reasons you said you resigned from the Putin administration. Many deeply observant people, some of whom were Russian, Vladimir Bukovsky, the American David Satter, have said that Russia is still not a normal place because it hasn't met the character of its Soviet past and the tremendous evils that were visited upon the Soviet peoples at that time. You may recall that Bukovsky tried to persuade Yeltsin to have the equivalent of the Nuremberg trials, except in Moscow, not with the intention of hanging people or engaging in severe punishments, but just a public admission of the evil that had taken place in the Gulag and the terrible repression of the Soviet state. And Bukovsky was extremely discouraged that did not happen. And of course, it still hasn't happened. And David Satter, in his books on Russia, on both the Soviet Union and Russia, speaks very deeply about this, that you can't be normal until moral reality is publicly restored. And you can't just whitewash it with, well, we're all Russian Orthodox right now. Now, President Putin definitely doesn't seem to be one who has looked in that direction at all. First of all, do you agree with that analysis?
Yes, definitely.
You do, yeah. But you don't see any hope for that happening?
Under Mr. Putin, definitely no chance.
Definitely not. Okay. I remember a very electric moment when Yakovlev made a statement in the Soviet press, and I had met him about a year prior to that in Moscow, where he was just giving us the standard Soviet propaganda line in the meeting we had with him. But he made a statement that he had come to see that that Leninism was based upon class hatred, and that this was evil. And I was working in the government at that time, and I faxed his statement all to everyone, saying it's over. You know, the head of the number 2 fellow in the Politburo has said this is evil, and he's now using Ronald Reagan's language, evil empire. He's saying it's evil. And I thought that there was a real turning of the soul in Yakovlev as he dedicated the rest of his life to the terrible religious persecution that had taken place in Russia. It was very impressive. I never had the sense Gorbachev had that turning of the soul. And obviously Putin has not had such a turning of the soul. Mm-hmm. Well, sorry for that little speech. Let me close then with, let's discuss the problem
let me just to comment a little bit on what you are saying. You're absolutely right, and this is a very important background, some kind of preliminary step. First of all, you need to have some kind of moral cleaning, some kind of coming back with moral grounds before you can make next steps. If in moral sense your soul is rotten, you cannot build anything really healthy and free and promising, something like that. So that is why it is absolutely necessary to do it. And we know that all cases of flourishing, whatever, personal freedom, human liberties, rule of law, real equality in terms of legal equality of people and so on. All these cases were based on very clear moral standards that followed by those people who were in the power. And we see how, when we are looking not only in the kind of third world countries, but even looking in the first world, in the most developed part of the world, when we see crumbling the pillars of the free society. Why? We understand that those people who are at the top, they don't have these moral principles. They do not follow these moral principles. They follow some other principle. And it is not in the laws. It is not in constitutions. It is not in so-called institutions of the society. It is in the moral grounds of individuals internally. And if those individuals are lacking those moral principles inside of them, then everything is possible. And that is why the foundations of free societies, of Western societies, are starting to be crumbled.
I couldn't agree with you more about that. But that brings us to the question of corruption in Russia, which is, of course, a moral problem, and it creates enormous economic problems as well.
You mentioned one of the reasons of my resignation. I can give you just a little story which was behind that.
Please.
I was invited to the meeting of Putin with a very close group of people. It was a dozen of people were, and they were discussing how to steal the 12 billion US dollars from the Russian government assets. Because I was a late comer to this discussion, I was the last person, because as I learned from this meeting, they already agreed about this, and just by some kind of coincidence, by mistake, they invited me. I never participated before, and there was Putin there. There was Mr. Medvedev. Then he was the head of administration, and later he became, for some period of time, president of Russia as well. There were Minister of Finance, Minister of Economy, head of the central bank, the head of the presidential administration, and many other people, just kind of a dozen of them. And they were talking what would be the best way how to steal 12 billion US dollars. When I happened there and listened to them, I said that it's illegal. It is criminal. It's against the criminal code of the Russian Federation. I was the only person among these dozen of people who said those words. And only one person understood me immediately and well. It was Mr. Putin, who in his body language immediately took it back and said, okay, it's not me, it's they. They discussed them. And we talk about that, but from this discussion being clear that they already decided, and Putin, for the first time, he did not support me. Usually he supported me, and became neutral, and became clear that he is part of this group. And the only one time that he intervened that I disclosed, because I studied this case, and I said that just one of them was trying to steal out of this $12 billion, $1.5 billion for himself, not sharing this money with others. And it was some kind of betraying this group of people, that they are not only kind of sharing this amount, but this part he's taking for himself. And it angered Putin. As he started to reprimand that person, saying, come on, how it's possible? For me, it was enough. What was the force that was driving me? Legal issues, constitution, law, friendship? No. Moral basis for myself. There was nobody around who would kind of judge whether right or not. For me, it was impossible to participate in this business, unlike others. For others, it was normal. Okay, that day they discussed 12 billion US dollars, another small amount. Next day will be larger amount. It doesn't matter. For them, there was no moral problem, because there was no cameras, TV cameras, there was no journalists. Nobody would even have any knowledge about this stealing operation, especially in such authoritarian regime or dictatorship. Nobody would know this. So they were absolutely sure that it would be absolutely hidden. And they could easily do it. Why? Because they did not have moral limitations for undertaking. And who can stand up to them? Those who follow it, not only whatever official institutions or laws, but who has different moral foundations.
So is it too extreme to call Russia a kleptocracy?
I don't like to make such a generalization, because it depends on people. There are some kleptocrats, and they are very honest people, even inside of the Russian government.
Still.
Even in the Russian administration, yes, definitely. So that is why, yes, you can say so, but it does not produce additional new meaning. You don't have nothing. Okay, you would find kleptocrats in the US government. You know people who are corrupted here.
Well, not who can take $1 billion at a sitting. But
But that's
we don't need.
but the problem is not about size.
No,
it's
I
a problem
understand.
about
It's
the
character.
fact. Yes.
So I'll close with just this, because the other reason was the consolidation of the Siloviki. So at what stage did you see Russia had sort of reached the point of no return in terms of the control by this group?
The crucial point was in 1999 when when Yeltsin appointed Putin as a prime minister, because that time he appointed the head of FSB, the political police, at the position of the prime minister, and later that year, on December 31st, he gave the power, acting president's power, to Putin. That was the turning point. After that, it is impossible to change.
But you didn't realize that until 2005, or you saw there was still hope? And
no, that just you need to acquire information, and just I studied this information, who did what, because not all these actions were visible.
I see.
Some people now claim, okay, they saw it. Okay, they were so smart, not like me. But I was also busy with economic program. You mentioned some of the acts that I was doing with my colleague. But when I studied when there was a turning point, I came to very firm conclusion. It was 1999.
Andrei, thank you very much for that insightful and indeed provocative talk and series of reflections. We most appreciate it.
Thank you, Robert, for inviting. It was a pleasure to be with you.
And thank you, those of you who have joined us for this program, which is available on the Westminster Institute website. And it appears along with our other videos on a variety of subjects, including about Russia, China, the Middle East, on our Westminster YouTube channel. So I hope you will join us in the future for other such programs. I'm Bob Riley, your host.